let us continue with our sociological functions, and I'm hoping this video will be a little louder. I'll see if I have the um, microphone in a better spot for you. So sociological functions, as I mentioned on the first video, are origins of things that relate to society as a whole. Psychological relates to the individual, and sociological to the society as a whole. So these kinds of myths explain how things are done and why. So why do we pray the way we do? Why do we farm the way we do? Why are we allowed to eat some foods and not others? Why can we marry this individual but not this one? So those are sociological functions. Some of the things addressed are taboos, things that are forbidden in particular cultures. You know, in some cultures, certain foods are not allowed to be eaten, or foods in conjunction with other foods are not allowed to be eaten. Marrying certain people can be a taboo, or women doing things at certain times of their menstrual cycles are taboo. What happens to people when they break these taboos? That is one aspect of the sociological function. So I have, for an example here, an edict that Robert Graves explains about red foods, in this case pomegranate, which is what Persephone is reported to have eaten while she was in the underworld, fruit from the pomegranate. Of course, the pomegranate, you eat the seeds, and the seeds are red. So red foods in particular cultures, Mesopotamian cultures, were only to be offered to the dead, so the living were not supposed to eat the seeds of a pomegranate. This would have been a taboo. So that's one example of what we're talking about with taboo. Another kind of sociological myth that we'll look at in more depth later in the semester are myths about culture heroes. Culture heroes are those figures that provide us with culture. Things about maybe how to catch particular foods or grow foods, what rituals to perform, how do we pray or worship our gods. These are often associated with one particular hero who brings those to the culture. And of course, in the Demeter Persephone myth, Demeter provides Triptolemus with instructions for how to plant, and we've already talked about her setting up rituals for worship. So those are some examples that fall under the sociological function. Both the mystical function and pedagogical functions are pretty brief. Mystical functions have to do with the sacred bond between a god and his or her people. So a myth might evoke those feelings of being either close to a god, maybe in some cultures believe in a more personal one-on-one relationship with the deity. Other cultures are more likely to tell myths in which the grandeur and the power of a god is established, but they provoke an emotional feeling for people. So mystical myths have this function. Pedagogical functions are pretty obvious for all of the myths. They're pedagogical, which means they're teaching. So they're teaching tools. They teach us how to live in our world, how to live in practical terms, how to do things, and also to transfer cultural ideas and historical ideas through the stories. So these are the functions that are on the exam, and again, some of them overlap. It would be your task to look at the function that best suits the myth that you're choosing to write about, or at least narrow it down to two functions, one or two functions, but that overlap is there. I've decided to give you some other functions as well. So we already talked about establishing rituals. We'll talk about myth and ritual towards the end of the semester. We'll talk about the sacrifice of the king, sacrifice of deities and the rituals that accompany that. And of course, the Demeter and Persephone story is sort of at the heart of that. She is sacrificed, Persephone is, to her uncle slash husband Hades, and there are rituals that accompany that. We can look at functions that, we already talked briefly about this, and psychological function that relate to gender issues like feminism. We'll talk a bit about historical functions, the idea that in all myths there are perhaps traces of real events that have been either distorted over time or have been added to. Maybe there was at one time a young woman named Persephone, and she was maybe a princess or someone of a royal family, and stories became attracted to her. She was like a magnet and attracted more and more stories to herself, overshadowing her original story and becoming something much more. Graves reads the abduction of Persephone by Hades as a metaphorical story about the overthrowing of matriarchal societies by the influx of male patriarchal warrior societies. So he looks for historical meanings behind all of these myths. So there's our functions. We'll be talking about these again more as we move throughout the semester, but this is just a brief introduction to them.